Here we are. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Shirley and Michael for the sponsorship. Should be the Ilu Neshama on the yahrzeit of your dear family members. I was thinking today, because we're really still in the Shavuos state of mind, to look a little bit deeper at some of the fascinating themes that come up in Megillas Rus. Just as a one-off for Shavuos, Megillas Rus is something one doesn't often get a chance to learn in depth. As I say, Yom Tov passes by quickly, and between the night learning and the cheesecake and the various other activities, Megillas Rus is read, you zip through it, and that's the end of that. I do recommend actually learning Megillas Rus. It is a most remarkable Megillah, and it contains lots of very fascinating themes. Just to start off with, what are the reasons that people have heard? I'm asking this as a question. You have to unmute yourself if you have an answer. What are the reasons people have heard for reading Megillas Rus on Shavuos? What is the connection between Megillas Rus and Shavuos? I'm taking offers. Any offers?
There's many reasons.
I'd like to hear one.
Well, I'll tell you two off the bat. 3. Rabbi Wein was talking yesterday that the Torah started with Chesed and ended with Chesed, and there is an inyan of all
okay,
this
so maybe one answer is Chesed, but that's a very, very general answer. But
right.
Yes, it is.
But no, okay, about the line of, it was Shavuos is the yahrzeit of David HaMelech, and this is his genealogy, and
Right.
showing that he's
Okay, so
legitimate.
second,
But another answer that I heard
One
in
second,
the
yeah,
shir,
just one second. So another explanation is that according to Chazal, we don't find this in the Tanakh, but according to Chazal, we have a Maseres that Shavuos is the yahrzeit of David HaMelech, and therefore Megillas Rus is in some way establishing the genealogy of David HaMelech. So the connection is David HaMelech. Yes. Anything else?
Kabbalah Satira.
Kabbalah's HaTorah, yes. That's a very, very interesting one. Kabbalah's HaTorah. In other words, that Sinai and Shavuos was a national Kabbalah's HaTorah with lots of kolos, ubrokim, and a massive public event on a national scale, on a cosmic scale, actually. And Rus really is an example of Kabbalah's HaTorah, of accepting the Torah on a very private, personal level, right? So in actual fact, reading Megillas Rus is in some way contains the message that it's not sufficient to really connect to the major national event of receiving the Torah, but what's required is on an individual personal level in your heart to somehow emulate a Rus who came from outside of the Jewish people, and she of her own initiative was Makabeles HaTorah as she received the Torah. Good. Any other offers?
yeah, there's another one, that the whole inyan of whether a Moabitess could be accepted as a legitimate member of Khalasa is a halacha Moshe Sinai, and that's a very important concept.
Okay, right. Let me stop you there. Judith has definitely been doing her homework. Everybody here can see.
We got that from the Shirim at Beit Knesset HaNasi.
In advance, and I was going to ask this question. And yes, there is another issue here, is that in some way, some important way, this particular din, that the female members of the Moab nation are acceptable as Gerim, whereas the males are not. This is not explicitly in the Torah. The Torah says, "Oh, lo yovo amoni b'kal Hashem," that the Moabites are not acceptable as Gerim. Chazal came along with this chidush, right? That only applies to the male members and not to the female members. And it's only because of this din, which is really, as Judith mentioned, according to one opinion, it's halacha l'Moshe Messina. In other words, it's simply a part of the oral tradition that we know that Rus was acceptable, and only because of this din was David HaMelech acceptable as a full member of Klal Yisrael. So in actual fact, what we see here is, just to expand a little bit on this point, that we read the Megillas Rus in order to give if you like, a tangible example of the fact that at Har Sinai, not only was the written Torah given, but also the Torah Shebaal Peh, also the oral tradition of the Torah was also given at Sinai, and anybody who denies the Torah Shebaal Peh, actually, here's the interesting thing, denies the validity of David HaMelech. In other words, David HaMelech's whole status as Melech Yisrael is sort of hanging by a thread, and the thread is this din in Torah Shebaal Peh. And this is, as you probably know, the issue of accepting the validity of Torah Shebaal Peh throughout the history of the Jewish people has always been one of the, how shall I put it, a red line dividing Orthodox Judaism from non-Orthodox Judaism, going back to the Tzaddukim and later on the Karaites, and in the last 200 years, the conservative and Reform Judaism. Even those conservative and Reform Jews who do accept the Chumash, they don't accept Torah Shebaal Peh. It's something important to understand that really, when you read, I unfortunately, part of my job is to read a lot of apikorsis. That is sort of part of my, what can I do? That's part of my job. I have to read a lot of the writings of the conservative and Reform rabbis in order to see what they're saying, in order to be able to enter into discussions and debates of one sort or another. But it's sometimes very confusing because we tend to think that the Reform and conservative rabbis and Reform and conservative Jews don't share our beliefs. And that is only partly true because many of them do believe very fervently. They believe in God. They believe that God hears our tefillas. They believe in Olam Haba. They believe in a lot of the spiritual beliefs of Judaism. They don't believe in the validity of Torah Shebaal Peh. So the conservative and Reform don't accept, and you have to be careful about this. There is, when you pick up a book in a bookshop, which is entitled Rabbinic Judaism, you have to be very careful because Rabbinic Judaism, when I speak about Rabbinic Judaism, I mean Mitzvos D'Rabbanan. I mean the writings of Chazal. But the conservative and Reform, when they speak about Rabbinic Judaism, they mean that the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Gemara, they didn't have an oral tradition. They made it up. They invented it. And because they invented it, we can accept it or reject it as we like because it doesn't have a divine origin. And this question about the divine origin of Torah Shebaal Peh is really at the heart of really the dividing line between Orthodox on the one hand and conservative Reform and other so-called, in inverted commas, progressive Judaisms on the other hand, that they deny. So really, for example, when the Torah says about Shabbos, lo saseh kol malacha, you mustn't do any work. So what is work? The Torah doesn't tell us what constitutes work, right? When you're writing a letter, is that work? When you're driving your car, is that work? So the Torah Shebaal Peh tells us in Masechet Shabbos in the Mishnah, what are the 39 malachas and what constitutes work? But if you don't accept the Torah Shebaal Peh as the authoritative interpretation of the Torah, then what is work on Shabbos is up to you, right? And that's in fact what the conservative and Reform movement believe, that indeed one should keep Shabbos and one shouldn't work, but what is work? Well, everybody has to decide for themselves what they consider to be work. Maybe driving to the beach and writing a letter, as far as they're concerned, is not work. It's not work because they haven't got Torah Shebaal Peh. Okay, coming back to Rus for a minute. Reading Megillas Rus is about reading Megillas Rus is about the enormous significance of the Torah Shebaal Peh, to such an extent that even David HaMelech and ultimately the Mashiach is only, if you like, a valid concept for us, right? When we say in our davening, as Tzemach David Avdecho Mehera Tatzmiach, right? That we're waiting, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, that all that only works if we accept the Torah Sheba'al Peh. I just saw on the chat a note from Michael Gross that, of course, another interesting connection between Rus and Shavuos is that Shavuos is called in the Torah Chag HaKotzir, celebrating the harvest. And Rus is very much, in the story of Rus, is very much the theme of the Katsir HaSaorim and the Katsir HaChitim, and Rus gleaning the droppings in the field is very much a central theme in Megillas Rus. So it's all about the significance of the harvest and certain aspects of the Leket Shikha and Peh of the harvest. So there's some very interesting themes here in Rus which connect it to Shavuos in lots of fascinating ways. I'd like to just add one, and maybe I'm just going to bring you an interesting text, and that is the whole concept of Geirus, of conversion, right? The concept of Geirus is one of the trickiest concepts that Rabbonim and Botei Din have had to deal with throughout the ages, and our generation is not an exception to that rule. I think if you ever meet a Dayan in a Beis Din here in Israel and you ask him what is the trickiest issue you have to deal with, he will tell you the trickiest issue is who is Jewish, who is actually Jewish in this country, and who isn't Jewish, and who's been converted properly and who hasn't been converted properly, and what is a proper conversion. And it's well known that up to 25% of the hundreds of thousands of Russians who came into this country were not Jewish halachically, but they became Israelis, and some of them went through conversions, and some of those conversions were valid, and some were bogus. And how does one tell the difference? And how does one deal with conversions in general? Is a very, very difficult nut to crack, especially as most Dayanim or most Botei Din that I've spoken to, and I've spoken to quite a few over the years, have told me that they are well aware that over 50% of the people they convert actually eventually abandon a Jewish practice and go back to the lifestyle they had beforehand. In other words, it's not something which has a very good, if a business consultancy firm came in and did a viability report on the effectiveness of conversion and tracked people 10 years later, I think they would be rather shocked at what they find. Nevertheless, there is a very good percentage of very firm and committed and remarkable Gerim who are an inspiration to us all. Whenever you meet somebody who is a real Ger or Geores, I always ask them what motivated you and how you did it, and I'm always inspired by their story. They've often got a story about a journey that they've made into Judaism, and it is very, very inspirational. Maybe I'll just tell you one Rashi in that respect. You know, in the center of Hallel, we say 4 times Ki La'olam Chasto, right? Hodel Hashem Kito Ki La'olam Chasto, Yom Ano Yisrael Ki La'olam Chasto, Yom Runo Beis Aaron Ki La'olam Chasto, and then Yom Runo Yirei Hashem Ki La'olam Chasto. So who are the Yirei Hashem? We've already spoken about Yisrael in general, and we've spoken about Beis Aaron as a special case. And then there is a 4th category of Yirei Hashem, right? The first category, if you like, is mankind. The whole of mankind has to be grateful to God for the creation and for life itself. That's Hodel Hashem Kitov. And then there's Yom Ano Yisrael. Yisrael have got special reasons to be thankful, right? For the Torah and Mitzvos and Jewish life. And then Yom Ano Beis Aaron, they've got very special reasons to be thankful. Who are Yirei Hashem? Who is this 4th category? So if you have a look in Rashi, Rashi says these are the Gerim. This is a reference to the Gerim, the genuine Gerei Tzedek who have joined Klal Yisrael, people like Rus, people like Yisro, and people like the many thousands in every generation who have with a full heart joined Klal Yisrael. And there's a special one of the Tariag mitzvahs is for Hafto es Ager. We have to go the extra mile to look after genuine Gerim. The big problem is to differentiate between genuine Gerim and bogus Gerim, and that is a nightmare for every Dayan and every Rav. But why is this interesting for me at the moment? And that is because Rus, of course, represents a classic case of a Giores, a woman who comes from outside of the Jewish world and converts in, right? And the story of Megillas Rus is used in Chazal as a sort of a paradigm case. And we learn certain halachas of Gerus from Rus. And what's that got to do with Shavuos? So let me show you a Rambam. We're now going to have a look if my screen share is working nicely. Not so great. Bear with me for 1 second. Bear with me for 1 second. I'll get there in a second. I've got here a few bit of material here. So let's have a look at this. This is the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, Hilchos Yisurei Bia. Eli, you see a text? Yes? Good, good. So the Rambam starts off by saying, Bishlosha Devarim Nichnasu Yisrael Labris. Right? In 3 ways, the Jewish people entered into the covenant. What is he referring to? He's referring to Har Sinai, is the covenant Bris Chorev, the covenant at Har Sinai. So at Har Sinai, what he's talking about is, apart from saying Na'aseh v'Nishma, which of course is Kabbalat HaMitzvot, is accepting to do the mitzvahs, there were 3 things that were required. One of them was Milah, says the Rambam, there's Milah. The men had to be circumcised. There was Tevilah, everybody had to be immersed, and there was a korban. At the time, when you have a base of Mikdash, a korban was required, right? So these are the 3 ways in which the Jewish people entered into the covenant. It says the Rambam, Milah hoisa b'Mitzrayim. The Milah they already did 7 weeks earlier, because it says Kol Oreh lo yochel bo, that somebody uncircumcised couldn't participate in the korban Pesach. Mol osam Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu organized a national Milah prior to Yetzias Mitzrayim, because in Mitzrayim they had lost the Milah. What about Tevilah? Where do we find Tevilah? Tevilah haisa b'midbar. Tevilah haisa b'midbar. Second. Tevilah haisa b'midbar kodem matan Torah. Shenemar v'kidashtam hayom umocha v'chibsu simlosam. This is a pasuk that we read in shul yesterday morning, right? In chapter 19, which is the preamble to the Aseres HaDibros, and it says v'kidashtam hayom umocha. That is a reference to immersion in a mikveh, and the third one is the korban that they brought, Shenema v'yishlach es nari yisrael, etc., etc. Okay. So what we find here is what's the Rambam doing? The Rambam says, let's look carefully at Ma'amad Har Sinai, at the events of Shavuos, of the first Shavuos, and Har Sinai. And apart from accepting the mitzvahs, there were 3 mechanisms which together enabled Klal Yisrael to be nichnas labris, right? Milah, Tevilah, and the korban. And says the Rambam then, v'chein l'deiros, and similarly for all future generations. In other words, Matan Torah was the template, right? Was the model on which all of Gerus for future generations was modeled. V'chein l'deiros. So if we're asking what's the connection between Shavuos and Megillas Rus, the answer is Rus is a prime example of somebody who entered into Gerus, into conversion, and the conversion was at Har Sinai. And what the Rambam's actually saying here is something very fascinating, that actually at Har Sinai, the Bnei Yisrael were converted. In other words, the whole of the Jewish people went through a conversion, right? Prior to Har Sinai, there was no Jewish people. the Jewish people didn't exist yet. There was this group of people who were the children of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But technically speaking, the Jewish people only came into existence at Har Sinai when they were all converted. They were all Gerim. They were all Gerim. Actually, there's an interesting question that was raised by some of the Meforshim. The Meshech Chochmah speaks about this at some level, at some length. He says that after that series of Dibros, it says, and now Shuvu lachem la'alechem. Now you can go back to your families. In other words, at Har Sinai, they were raised to a very high level spiritually, and then after the Shuvu lachem la'alechem means it's over, and now you can go back to normal life, go back to your families. So the Meforshim asked, well, wait a minute. They had just learned in the Torah some new halachas about who they're allowed to be married to and who are they not allowed to be married to. So, for example, some people had married even, let's say, Amram, the father of Moshe, was an example of somebody who had married someone that you're not allowed to marry, right? He'd married his aunt, right? Now, marrying your aunt is one of the Isurei Kores. It's a Premier League Arroyos situation, right? One isn't allowed to marry one's aunt, and even if you do, the marriage doesn't work because it's considered, it's one of the list in Achremos of Isurei Bion. I'm reminded actually of an anecdote in my rabbinic life of somebody who in our community, it wasn't actually a member of the community, but an occasional member of somebody who came to daven with us. And it was one weekday morning after davening, a man who'd been divorced for a few years, and he was looking around to get remarried. And so it's after davening in the morning, and I'm preparing for my shir, and I'm putting away my talis and tefillin, and he comes up and says, "Oh, Rabbi, things are looking good for me. I've met this woman, and it's looking good, and we'll probably get married." I said, "I'm very happy for you. Is she a good, is she a from woman? Yeah, very nice, etc., etc. What are you doing?" I said, how did you meet her? I'm not even really paying much attention. I'm sort of really, how did you meet her? He says, well, I met her at a family event. I said, why did you meet at a family event? Because, he says, she used to be married to my uncle. My father's brother was married to this woman, right? And they were married for a few years, then they got divorced. And now she's roughly my age. I'm dating her, and we could get married. Okay, at that point, I said, right, it's time for you to sit down for a minute. I've got some news for you, and that is you can't marry a woman who was your aunt. It's a violation of the Hilchos Arroyos of the Torah. No Orthodox rabbi will marry you, and any children who are born out of that union will be mamzerim. It's a first-class Isur Torah to marry your aunt. Why is it so? I don't really know. There aren't any reasons given in the Torah for the Isurei Arroyos, but I had to tell this fellow gently the bad news that this woman might be a very nice woman, and I'm very pleased that he's found someone who's a good friend of his, but he shouldn't think for a minute that he can marry her because she is his aunt. The fact that his uncle has divorced her is neither here nor there. She is and always will be forbidden to him as achos, sort of Eishes Achi Oviv, the wife of his father's brother, and that is one of the Arroyos. Anyhow, why do I mention this? Because clearly there were, but Amram married his aunt. Why did he marry his aunt? It was before Matan Torah. He didn't know. He didn't know it was awesome. So here's an interesting question. After Matan Torah, several people have found out that they are now married to somebody who the Torah disapproves of. So how can the Torah give a blanket statement, asks the Meshech Chochmah, that shuvu lechem la'olechem, that you can go back to your families? Maybe you can't. Not everybody can. So he says, now, that is the din of a ger. A ger is ger shenisgayer kekoton shenoilad. A ger, once a ger goes through gerus, he doesn't have any more family connections in halacha. It's a very complex and it's an interesting halacha. In other words, technically speaking, I mean, it sounds pretty awful, but technically speaking, if a non-Jewish brother and sister went through gerus, they could subsequently marry each other. However, the Chachamim, from the very beginning, of course, forbade it for various reasons. But technically speaking, halakhically speaking, a brother and sister who convert are no longer halachically considered to be family to each other, because the ger is considered a completely new person. Says the Meshech Chochmah, the whole of Klal Yisrael at Har Sinai were gerim. They'd all converted, right? They had all converted, and therefore any isurim, any isurim which had been created by forbidden unions were no longer valid. That's the Meshech Chochmah. That's a bit of a longer story, separate subject for a whole shir. But why do I mention this? Because we just looked at the Rambam. We just looked at the Rambam who says, "V'chein l'deiros," that what happened in Har Sinai is a paradigm, is a model for all future generations. Whenever any non-Jew wants to enter the covenant, and to enter into a life which is tachas kanfei hashchina, beautiful poetic language here of the Rambam, right? That by joining Klal Yisrael, we are entering into a different realm of hashgacha, of protection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I'd like to add, in our current days and current atmosphere here in Israel, we certainly need an extra dose, I think, of kanfei hashchina, of protection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu from our genocidal enemies who are looking for every opportunity to destroy us. And it's a very, very sad situation. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should protect us, protect the soldiers, and strengthen the security people to act on behalf of the Rebbeinu Shalom to protect Klal Yisrael. Anyhow, says the Rambam, for l'deiros, the key word here is l'dorot. L'dorot means all through, as he translates it, throughout the generations. Any non-Jew who wants to enter the covenant, to come under the wings of the presence of God, accept upon him or herself the yoke of the Torah, the first thing he has to do is, So the first thing he has to do is v'yikabel all of old Torah. He first has to, there's Kabbalat Torah. There is saying Na'aseh v'nishma, right? The ger or gieres has to come before the Beis Din and declare that they are accepting to lead a life of mitzvot. And then in addition to that, they need milah, u'tevila, v'atzos karba, right? They need these three things, right? So this is I wanted to mention, just as an important starting point, an important aspect of the whole of Megillas Rus and its connection to Har Sinai is that Rus really represents the Geirus process. And the Geirus process was something which was at the heart of the whole of the Sinai event. In addition to hearing the Kol Hashem and seeing the Kolos of Rokim and being present at the most amazing transformational moment of the Jewish people, in addition to that, they were all misgaya. Every member of Klal Yisrael went through Geirus at that point. That's what the Rambam is saying. And therefore, in all future generations, we are going to imitate that with the Geirim. And the Ger needs to go into a bit of training to train him or herself for Shabbos and Kashrus, etc. And that's one of the big problems here in this country at the moment. You know, there are people who do want to become Jewish. Many of the Russians and also not the Russians want to become Jewish, but they don't want to do mitzvahs. And that is a massively difficult issue because in the modern, in modern Israel, there's a bit of a disconnect between being Jewish on the one hand and doing mitzvahs on the other hand. In the Torah, there is no difference between being Jewish and doing mitzvahs. If you're Jewish, that is expressed by doing mitzvahs. If you're doing mitzvahs, you're Jewish. This is all one and the same thing. If somebody comes, as they often do, come to the Beis Din and say, look, I want to become Jewish, I want to convert. And they say, well, wait a minute. you know, there's kashrus, there's niddah, there's Shabbos, there's Yom Kippur, there's Pesach, there's all these things, and say, well, wait a minute, I just want to become Jewish. I don't want to clean my house for Pesach. I don't want to, I don't want to keep Shabbos. I just want to be Jewish. Right? And they don't realize that this is actually a contradiction in terms. There is no such thing as becoming Jewish and not accepting mitzvahs. And this is a massive problem, right? What they really mean is they want to be Israelis. Yes, somebody just texted me that. Well, they want to be Israelis. That's what they want to be. Now, the truth is, the Israel government will accept them as Israelis even without conversion. If they have, let's say, a Jewish father or even a Jewish grandfather, they will be accepted as Israelis, but in halacha, they're not. And these people are living in a bit of a twilight zone. I've met quite a few of them, and it's a bit sad. There are many tens of thousands of people who are full Israeli citizens, right? But they're not halachically Jewish. And therefore, if they want to get married or even buried, there are problems involved through the Rabbanut. All the areas which are under the control of the Rabbanut won't work for them because they're not halachically Jewish. This is one of the very, very tricky issues. I've never met anybody really who claims they know a solution to this problem. I certainly don't have a solution to this problem. One feels a lot of sympathy for people who are people living in Israel, and they're paying their taxes, they're serving in the army, and they're very productive and important people in the community, and they're lovely people. They're just not Jewish, and they're not Shomer Mitzvos, and they're not willing to be Shomer Mitzvos. In many cases, they're living in a kibbutz or a moshav where there is no kashrus, there is no Shabbos, there aren't even any mezuzahs. And obviously they can't live a Jewish life under those circumstances. It's simply physically impossible for them to do so. And yet they want to be accepted into Klal Yisrael fully and become Jewish. And it's a conundrum. It's something which is, as far best of my knowledge in our generation, it's unfixable. Anyhow, I call upon him Rus. Rus was an example of somebody who came into Klal Yisrael believe ubenefesh. And in fact, many female giores, every ger and giores takes on a new name when they convert. And the name Rus became a very popular name for a female giores because of this story of Rus that she accepts to do. Okay, what I'd like to do now is have a look at, just 1 second. Have a bit of a look, more of a look at Megillas Rus. Bear with me for 1 minute, please. Okay. I hope you're impressed, ladies and gentlemen, that the speed with which I can get all the text up on the screen is getting better. Do you know what I mean? I'm already, I think, in Kita Bet with regards to Zoom. I was in Kita Aleph for a year. I feel I'm somewhat in Kita Bet. Also partly because I've got a new Wi-Fi system. So I think we're a bit more professional. Let's read a few psukim here together, ladies and gentlemen. The opening psukim of Megillas Rus set a scene which is already quite complicated. Okay, everybody with me? Vayhi bimei shafot hashoftim. It was at the time of the judges. What this means actually is we're talking. There's a book in the Tanakh called Shoftim, right? After the book of Joshua comes the book of Judges, the book of Shoftim. So this is taking place at the time of Shoftim, when the Jewish people were already living in Israel, but there wasn't as yet no king, and there was no Yerushalayim, and they were living in a very sort of tribal, rural existence. What happened? Vayhi ra'av ba'aretz. At some point, there was a famine, and what happened? Vayelech ish mi beis Lechem Yehuda. A man went from Beis Lechem Yehuda, Logur b'stei Moav, and he went to live in the country of Moab. Moab is what we call today Jordan. What we call today Jordan in biblical time was called Moab. In fact, if you ever go to the Dead Sea and you're sunning yourself or bathing in the Dead Sea, and you look across to the other side of the Dead Sea, you can see mountains, right? In Jordan, you can see the Jordanian mountains. They are called Harei Moav. Those are the mountains, the mountains of Moab are there just on the other side of the Dead Sea. Anyway, he went to live in Moab because in Moab apparently there was food. And who did he go with? Who v'ishto u'shnei bonov? He went with his wife and his two sons. At this point, interesting to note, we don't yet know his name. The story begins. The names are not important. What's important is there is a famine. It's a time of difficulty, and this man takes his family and goes to live in Moab. I'd like to just add, just in terms of context here, you understand that at this point in Jewish history, there was no diaspora. In other words, no Jews lived outside of Israel. There was no such thing. No Jews lived in Moab or in Egypt or in Syria or anywhere outside of Israel. The Jewish people lived in Israel, full stop, right? And therefore, leaving Israel to go and live in the land of Moab was a major departure from Jewish life, right? There was no Jewish life in Moab, right? There was no kosher kingdom or any sort of local shtibels or local shuls or kehillas or anything at all. There was nothing Jewish there at all. They went into a place which was 100% non-Jewish environment. To be fair, we would say about them, they went, the Pasuk does give them a little bit of justification because of the Ra'av, right? The famine in the land is cited here as the reason why they went. Okay, let's move on. V'shem ho'ish Elimelech, that was his name. V'shem ishto Nomi, v'shem shnei bonov Machlon v'Chilion. He had two sons called Machlon v'Chilion, Ephratim, right? Ephratim, various different explanations of the word Ephratim means. Many of you are aware there's a town called Ephrat nowadays, just outside Beit Lechem. And that's where it got its name from, because the Pasuk here says Ephratim in Beit Lechem Yehuda. So there is a connection here between Ephrat and Beit Lechem, right? Although the Ephratim, some of the Meforshim simply say that Ephratim is another word for nobility. It means people of the aristocracy. Elimelech wasn't a regular person. He was part of the aristocracy and the leadership of the Jewish people. And then it says, "Vayovu Sedei Moav," and they came to the fields of Moab. And then it says, interesting, Vayiyusham. And this word Vayiyusham is actually understood to be an interesting and important part of the Pasuk. Even at first sight, it's a bit irrelevant. What does it mean? The Pasuk could have ended Vayovu Sedei Moav, full stop. What does it mean Vayiyusham? So Chazal say Vayiyusham means originally they went there as a temporary measure to escape the famine, but Vayiyusham means they settled. Because once they got there, they quite liked it there. They quite liked it in Moab, right? The way of life and the environment and everything, even though they had abandoned the land of Israel. We'll see a bit about that in a minute. What happened? Vayomos Elimelech ish Naomi, v'tishoah hi u'shnei boneh. Elimelech dies, and clearly he dies as a, we see later on that his death is mentioned here as some form of a punishment for something which he's done wrong, although we don't know yet exactly what he's done wrong. We'll have a chance, we'll have a look at the Rambam in a few minutes. So she is left a widow with her two sons, and in Pasuk 4 comes the bombshell. Pasuk 4 is really where the whole story falls apart. By Yisu Lahem Noshim Moavios. They married non-Jewish women. Right? This was part of their settling down in Moab, was to marry local girls. Shemo Achas Orpah, Shemo Shenis Rus. These were two Moaviot, two Moabite women. But Yesh Rishon Ke'eser Shanim, and they lived there for 10 years with these non-Jewish women. So here you have already a double tragedy. Well, multiple tragedy. The first tragedy is that they left Israel. The second tragedy is that Elimelech dies. The third tragedy is that the only children she's got are these two boys, and they both marry out. They both marry out. The next level of the tragedy, I mean, this whole begins with multiple tragedies. Vayomusu gam shnehem, Machlon v'Chilion. Machlon and Chilion also die, even though they were young men. They both die. But Isha mishnei yolodeho meisha, and Naomi is left actually destitute, no husband, no sons. Her whole family has been lost, and she's lost her country. She's lost her place of origin, and in a sense, she's lost her identity as well. She's no longer part of the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael at the time. So she's in a foreign land with no family at all. I'd like to just make an interesting point here about the word that we use in Lashon HaKodesh to mean a child, right? A ben and a bat are the words we use for a son and a daughter. But the word ben and bat actually mean much, much more than a son and a daughter. And in a sense, they are contrasted with another Hebrew word, which is yeled and yalda. Yeled and yalda also means a son and a daughter, right? So what does ben and bat actually mean? So this is actually a very interesting side topic, but we find several times, for example, in the Kriyas Shema, we find the Pasuk says, V'shinantom levonecha v'dibarto bo. You should teach Torah levonecha to your children, right? Says Rashi, who are your children? Says Rashi, Elu hatalmidim. These are your students. In other words, the students of a person, they are their children, right? And Rashi goes on to say, V'chein motzinu b'chol makom, that the talmidim are called the children. In other words, when we use the word ben and bat, we don't necessarily mean a biological connection between two people. A ben and a bat is a reference between somebody who is a teacher and somebody who is willing and able to accept teachings and instructions from that person. That's the ben. The ben and the bat, they are the people who are receiving a value system and instructions. And therefore, even in situations where a person has no biological children, if they have people who they have taught, right, people who have looked up to them as role models and as teachers, they are considered in the Torah as the bonim, as the children, right? And in multiple places, we find, for example, the Gemara says that if someone teaches someone Torah, ki'ilu yoldo, it's as if he gave birth to him, which means that becomes your children. And indeed, I'm sure you're all aware that over the generations, there were many Gedolei Yisrael who had no biological children at all, right? The late Lubavitcher Rebbe had no biological children, and yet he influenced the lives of tens of thousands of people, right? And more. And therefore they were his bonim and bonos. They were his descendants, spiritually descendants. Also, for example, and here comes an interesting, yes, the late Rav Shmuel Auerbach didn't have any children. The Chazon Ish didn't have any children. The Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin didn't have any children. There are quite a number of significant spiritual leaders in Klal Yisrael who were not zoche to have children. And yet they had many hundreds of bonim and bonos because they were teachers and they influenced them. In other words, the idea of a ben and a bas is someone who has received your values and your teachings and is continuing it. And that's the ben and the bas. That is and in actual fact, both the word ben and the word bas, right, are in Hebrew, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch points out in a few places, are both related to building, right? Ben comes from the word binyan, and bas comes from the word bayit, right? So ben and bas are both building. You're building a future house, right? The bat is the bias, and the ben is the binyan, right? The active binyan and the actual house itself that is being built are the ben and the bas. However, if sadly one has a child, an actual offspring, who doesn't follow in the path of the parents and doesn't learn the Torah and doesn't accept the values, then technically speaking, of course, they will always be yiladim. They will always be the children, the biological offspring of the parent, but they won't be the ben and the bas. So I want to show you just for a second something very fascinating in the text of Rus. So have a look at this. Pasuk 1, we're going back to Pasuk 1. Ladies and gentlemen, pay attention. In the first Pasuk, who goes to live in Moab? So it says here, Hu ve'ishto u'shtei bonov. He goes with 2 sons, right? And they're referred to as his sons. Okay, Pasuk 2, it says again, Elimelech and Naomi, V'shem shnei bonov, Machlon v'chilyon. Machlon v'chilyon are referred to as banav, are his sons. That's in Pasuk 2. Okay, move on to Pasuk 3. Elimelech dies, V'tishoe Naomi shnei boneha. So the first 3 psukim, in the first 3 psukim of Megillas Rus, in each one of these 3 psukim, Machlon and Chilyon are referred to as boneha. Are you with me? They're her children. Pasuk 4 is the bombshell pasuk. Vayisu noshim avias. They marry out, right? They marry non-Jewish women. And then Pasuk 5's, well, look what it says in Pasuk 5. Pay attention to the Hebrew text. They die. But they're no longer called boneha. Can you see this? The pasuk doesn't want anymore to call these sons. It doesn't want to call them anymore boneha. The first three pasukim called them boneha, and the 4th pasuk speaks about they married out, and the 5th pasuk speaks about yilodeha. Very fascinating. It's a very subtle shift in the Hebrew language, but I think in this context it's quite significant, right? They've married these Moabite women, and therefore, of course, they are yilodeha. They will always remain her biological children, but the pasuk doesn't want anymore to call them boneha. And even the first 3 psukim use that word. Okay, so that's an interesting thing to notice. Okay. Why did Elimelech? Clearly, the pasuk wants to tell us something about Elimelech and the fact that he died. And sorry, 1 second. I want to share with you a Rambam here. Let's have a look at a Rambam. Let's see if we can get this. Okay, so the Rambam here is talking about the whole issue of people who live in Israel leaving Israel. To leave Israel, the Rambam takes the view that if you're living in Israel, so to leave Israel is a problem. Because leaving Israel is leaving a place of greater Kedusha for a place of lesser Kedusha. So look what the Rambam says here. One is not allowed, generally speaking, to leave the land of Israel to go and live in Chutz La'aretz. Elo, there can be some good reasons. There can be reasons which are justifiable. So the first one is Elo Lilmod Torah, right? If a person wants to engage in learning Torah and he finds that the people who can teach him and the place to learn Torah was more in Chutz La'aretz than in Israel, he's allowed to go to Chutz La'aretz to learn Torah. I think in our generation, it's true to say that Israel itself has become a world center of Torah, and it's unusual for people to say, I have to leave Israel in order to learn Torah. However, if you go back, for example, to the time of the Talmud, the land of Israel was under very, very severe persecution and famine and great difficulties, right? The Talmidei Rabbi Akiva lived under Hadrianic persecutions and massacres, and Masada and Beitar and everything was a very, very hard time. And that's why, in fact, the Talmud is the Talmud Bavli. That's why the Torah center moved out of Israel into Bavel, Bavel being Iraq and Syria in the modern world. So Bavel became the Torah center. Lots of people left Israel in order to learn Torah. They moved from Israel to Bavel to learn Torah. Okay. The second reason, which might be worth, the Rambam says, is a justification for leaving Israel, is Lissa Isha. Lissa Isha, if a person can't find a shidduch in Israel, he can't find a zivug here in Israel, he can only find one in Chutz La'aretz. That's also a sufficiently powerful reason to leave Israel. Oh, there might be a financial reason, lahatzil min ha'akol. Or he might be allowed to lahatzil min ha'akum, to save himself financially. That's basically what it means here. That financially he needs to be saved in one way or another. But, says the Rambam, whenever you leave for any of these reasons, the yachzor la'oretz, he should have in mind always to come back to the land of Israel, right? So Elimelech, so long as he was in Moab and he had in mind to come back to Israel, so he was da'ato lachzor, right? He was still somebody who was only there temporarily. And I say this, I have said this to my community in Israel, in England, on many occasions, and that is, even though many of us are living permanently in Chutz La'aretz, in our heart and in our mind, we should feel that we're only here for the time being. We should all have a dream of going to live in Israel, v'yachzor la'aretz, to go back to Eretz Yisrael whenever possible. And then it says, v'chein yotzei hu l'schora. And similarly, one's allowed to go if you can't make a parnasa in Israel, then you're allowed to go to Chutz La'aretz to make a parnasa. And indeed, there are quite a few people who would love to come in Aliyah, but they feel they can't make a living here, and that's a whole different story. Anyhow, the Rambam's giving us here a short list of aspects of life which are sufficiently important that one is even allowed to leave Israel for them, getting married, making a parnasa, learning Torah, or to save oneself from the danger of from the non-Jewish world. These can be issues which could justify leaving Israel. But look what he says here now. Now we're going to come back to Megillas Rus. The af al pi shemuta lot says, even though these reasons give you a heta, they give you a permission to leave the language, to leave Israel, eino midas chasidus. It's not midas chasidus, right? He says, although it may be permissible to leave the country, it is not an act of piety to do so. In other words, people of greater stature are expected to live to a higher standard. Sadly, sometimes we don't see that. But ideally, anybody of a higher Torah stature should be living to a higher standard. And therefore, he says, even if there are any of these good reasons for whatever it is to leave Israel, it's not midas chasidus. And look what the Rambam here throws in. This is very fascinating. He says, look at this. He says, Sheharei Machlon v'Chilya, the two sons of Nomi, Shnei Gedolei Hadar Hoyu. A remarkable statement that. These were not ordinary boy chicks. These were Gedolei Hadar. These were great leaders of the generation. In other words, they were all three of them, Elimelech, Machlon, and Chilyon, were all people of status, people of if you like, aristocracy in Israel. Umipnei tzorol gedolo yotze, and they only went under great stress because of the famine. And nevertheless, says the Rambam, when it's chayvu kloya lamokim, they were punished by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, so what's the Rambam here saying? this piece of Rambam actually is a very fascinating thing here. He's saying that actually, Machlin and actually the truth is the Rambam is simply paraphrasing and giving us a clearer version of a Gemara in Baba Basra, which says exactly these things. That Machlin, V'chilya, and Elimelech, these three men, were killed or they lost their lives. They were punished by God. Why? Because they left Israel when they shouldn't have left Israel. They abandoned the land of Israel, even though there might be a technical justification for it, because there was a famine. Nevertheless, people like them were expected to live through the famine and somehow find a solution without leaving the land of Israel. This is an amazing statement by the Gemara and by the Rambam. But in general, really, it's a bit of a separate subject, the whole issue of staying in Israel and leaving Israel. But it's interesting that the Rambam brings down the death of Machlon and Chilion and attributes it to the Aveira of leaving the land of Israel. Or if you would have asked me, right, what was the Aveira of Machlon and Chilion, I would have said, what would you have said is the Aveira of Machlon and Chilion, ladies and gentlemen? Any offers? I would have said the Aveira of Machlon and Chilion is...
They married out.
Married out. They married out. If we're looking for an Aveira that they had committed, which might give them the punishment of being killed, right, of losing their lives, they married Noshim Nachrios. They married Noshim Nachrios, right? And that I would have thought that in terms, in the scale of misdemeanors in the Torah, leaving the land of Israel compared to marrying out is relatively minor, right? So why does the Rambam say that they would die because they left the land of Israel? Why doesn't he say he died because they married out? This is a little bit of a mystery in Megillas Rus. And very briefly, I'll just address this for a moment, and I'll follow some of the Meforshim, Ibn Ezra, and the Malbim, various different Meforshim say, clearly, Machlon and Chilion, they married these non-Jewish women, but before they married them, they in some way converted them. In other words, they didn't marry out. When you read the simple meaning of the pasuk, it seems like they married non-Jewish women, full stop. And we know in our generation what marrying out means. Marrying out means disconnecting yourself from Torah and Mitzvos. Says the Ibn Ezra, it's unthinkable that people like Machlon and Chilion would marry women unless they accepted the Mitzvos and accepted to behave, to live a life of Jewish women, and they converted them, right? And so that is clearly what the Rambam is saying here, that there was an initial conversion. Now, of course, it's difficult to imagine a technical conversion here because they didn't have a Bezdin, they didn't have the if you like, the institutions for Geirus, but they had a notional conversion in the sense of that these women would have gone to the mikvah and they would have accepted mitzvahs and accepted to live as Jewish women. And if not, this whole Rambam doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. The Rambam would say, I know why they were killed. They were killed because they left the land of Israel, right? Clearly, if they would have married out in the sense that we understand, they'd done something much worse. So you have a situation where the Rambam is telling us, and indeed many of the Meforshim make this point, that clearly Machlon and Chilion, before they married Rus and Orpah, they converted them in some way or another. And I'd just like to add to that later on, of course, when Rus meets Boaz, and Naomi says, oh, Boaz, I'm so pleased you've met Boaz. Migo aleinu hu, the pasuk says. He is a goel of ours. What does goel mean? He's a close relative of yours. He's a close relative of yours, and therefore Boaz marrying Rus is a type of Yibum. It's not an exact Yibum, but he is redeeming the land which belonged to Machlon and Chilion. He's redeeming the widow of Machlon, and that's called a goel. Now, let me ask you a question. If Rus only converts later on, but really when she married Machlon, she was a non-Jewish woman, then she's not related to Boaz at all. Not related at all. If they really got married as a non-Jewish woman, then Boaz and the whole of Machlon's family are not related to them at all. The marriage isn't valid, and there are no relatives, if she only is converted later on. It must be. If indeed Boaz is called the Goyel, that's a sure sign that there must have been a Gerus before Ruth married Machal. Must have been a Gerus. That seems to be the Rambam's position, and that seems to be Pshat. However, that creates massive problems, which I will solve for you next week. But there is a massive problem here. There's a massive problem. Because when Rus and Orpah say to Naomi, we'll go with you and follow you to Beis Lechem, what does she say to them? She says, no, go back, Isha Beis Abosa, go back to your homes, don't come with me, I've got nothing to offer you, I've got no more children, only a life of poverty and loneliness, don't come with me. If they're already converted and they're Jewish girls, why would she say something like that? Chas v'shalom, to say to a Giores, go back, doesn't make sense. So we have got in, once you dig deeper into Megillas Rus, a very fascinating contradiction within the narrative. It's impossible to say that Machal and Chilion didn't convert them before they married them, because otherwise Boaz is not the Goyel. And it's impossible to say they did convert them, because why would Naomi say go back and don't come? And that is a problem I'm going to leave you with if you can stand the tension. I know many of you will not be able to sleep this week, but next Tuesday, Bez Hashem, I will give you the answer. But I want you to appreciate that when you dig a bit deeper into Tanakh, you get into into deeper waters, that the story is much more complex than you think it is. What were Machal v'Chilion really doing? Who was Boaz really in terms of Rus? And what is Naomi's view about her two daughters-in-law? All this and more will be revealed next week if you stay tuned, and we will go further on this subject a little bit next week. I hope you're enjoying this. We'll take a bit of a break from Sefer Bereshis. I said Lichavod Shavuos. We'll take a bit of a break, and we will go further. If anybody wants to do some homework in the meantime and think that they can got an answer to this problem, I'm not going to take any answers now because it's already a few minutes past time. But if you have any answers at the beginning of next week's shir, I'd be interested to hear them. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Very nice to see you. I wish you a good Isru Chag. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should look after us. Hidei lo yonu v'lo yishon shomer Yisrael. The shomer Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should protect us from crazy enemies.